Hello and welcome to our launch of the CXC EMEA Labour Trends Report. Our survey was conducted sampling 1,200 C-suite executives, HR professionals, staffing experts, and HR technologists. We wanted to really look at four areas, which are labour trends, supply and demand, utilisation of talent platforms, borderless or international hiring, and remote work. And I'd just like to say thank you very much to our colleagues in the various CXC regions that have helped promote and publicise the report amongst your, the survey amongst your client and user base. We really appreciate it, folks. And also a big shout out to our friends, partners, and colleagues at Open Assembly who publicised the survey back in November, December. Really appreciate it, folks. So, guys, very pleased to welcome all of our audience today. But I'm delighted to welcome Anita, Lettink, and John Healy, who have very kindly agreed to discuss some of the survey and reports trends and also give their view on the wider HR and labour market. Anita is a partner at the Strategic Management Centre. She's a HR tech expert, and prior to that was a senior executive with NGA, which is a leading human resources firm globally. I'm also delighted to be joined by John Healy, who is the managing partner, expert in residence. I have to say, I really like that title, John, at the Center for Transformation of Work, which spun out of Harvard University in the United States. John is also the vice president of the Blockchain Task Force at the World Employment Confederation. And prior to that, where I first got to meet John, was at leading global outsourcer Kelly OCG, where John was a senior executive in the future work practice. Folks, I'm delighted to have you here today to talk about the Labour Trends Report. A very warm welcome to you both, but also to our audience, of course. I suppose looking over the last 2 years, guys, I don't think I can quite recall or have experienced such a tumultuous and transformational time in the world of work. Would you agree, Anita or John?
Yeah, so the reason why I'm hesitating a little bit is a lot of this had to do with remote work, of course, right? And I have been, let's say, a digital nomad / remote worker for the past 10 years. So for me, it was mostly business as usual, but I can also see how if you had never worked outside of your office walls, this was a huge transformation, but also a huge shock, right? Because almost overnight, you had to pick up your desktop and move it to your home, find a place to work with the kids probably at home and your partner as well. So for many people, it was a disruptive time. And I always like to especially focus on frontline workers, first responders, who did the best they could without the support that they needed. So I guess overall, yes, hugely disruptive for work. How about you, John?
Yeah, and Anita, I love the way that you reference that, because businesses have been using VUCA for 7, 8, 10 years now, right? I actually used that in a presentation last week, deliberately to point out this is a phrase we've been using for a long time. It's old, it's tired, we've all moved past it. So the volatility in the business has not been an issue. We've been talking about it. We kind of created a cottage industry around change management. It's the worker whose lives that has been transformed. They're the ones who have, their home became their workspace, became their gymnasium, became their schoolyard, became their restaurant, all simultaneously. They had to deal with change much more so than the business. The business had to start learning how to adapt to what the worker was expecting. And I think that's where you're seeing maybe the bigger change, and even the great resignation, whatever we want to call it right now, is because businesses have struggled to realize that the worker's life has changed, and I need to understand it a whole lot more.
Yeah, guys, I think that's really fair. And Anita, I like the way you touched on remote work as a case in point. But just thinking back over the 2 years, we've had the forced explosion of remote work. Essentially, it was mandated in most cases by governments. We had furlough, or essentially, people being paid for not working by the government, some form of universal basic income. We've had the mass enforced resignation or displacement in the workforce. And I want to come on to a paper, Anita, that Anita wrote back in December on the Great Resignation. I think, John, if you haven't had the chance to read it, or our audience, it's going to blow your mind. It really blew my mind, but I won't steal Anita's thunder too much in relation to that. We've got the labour market paradox, which I want to look at as well. We've got this great disconnect between millions of jobs available, millions of people unemployed and potentially available, but the two just don't marry up. Why the hell is that happening, right? And what can be done about it? Then we've had salary or wage inflation in multiple sectors. You talk to any restaurateur trying to get a commie chef, a pastry chef, a bar back, a waitress, a waiter, they're tearing their hair out, assuming that they still have some left, when it comes to managing salary and wage inflation. And of course, that's a trend that we're seeing anecdotally across the board, even in our own organization. I'm sort of crying myself to sleep at night, but anyway, you or the audience don't want to hear our problems. But I think it's sector specific and potentially an issue. And then we have the proliferation or growth in platforms, particularly the freelance management platforms, the public talent marketplace platforms. And of course, this largely has been a force multiplier accelerator from what happened with COVID. And I suppose even though we're emerging from our various lockdowns, we still can't bloody hide from it, because it's really changed our working lives, I think, in some cases for the better, in some cases clearly for the worse, given some of the employment related issues that we're seeing out there. So I'm really keen to get into some of those topics, guys, and we're just going to look at our first slide in relation to remote work. And I want to really discuss this. So what you'll see on the slide on the left, guys, or the bar chart on the left, is what our respondents thought about remote working. On balance, I think the general consensus is that it's a good thing. That doesn't really surprise me for those that have been working remotely. A lot of people that I've spoken with hated the idea of commuting to their office in the morning, hated the idea of the mindless chit chat, as they see it, with their colleagues, talking about their dogs and the weather and various other things that probably people just don't want to discuss. I think it's probably reduced some of the gossip at the water cooler and some of the bad behaviors in the workplace. But that particular bar chart doesn't shock me, right? But what does interest me is the bar chart on the right-hand side, which relates to do the survey respondents organizations support a fully remote working model? And the clear majority is in favor of a hybrid remote working policy. That doesn't really surprise me, because I think people want that balance. And I've noticed that some organizations have mandated people going into the office 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and they're seeing people literally leave those organizations. And then I've seen organizations that have went for a fully remote distributed model. And again, people aren't hugely comfortable with that either. There seems to be a clamor for some form of remote, but some form of workplace presence, if you like. So I suppose, guys, what's your views generally on remote working? Do you believe it's here to stay? And for those that can remote work, is it a good thing? John?
Sure, I'll jump into it. I think, Connor, as I look at this, and Anita, with your background in the technology side of things, I'll be intrigued as to your thoughts here. But I think that there's a bigger question about the why that's underneath. When you see a lot of the policies that are coming out related to work, you can hear the discomfort. I was forced into this. I accepted it. It worked out okay, but I want to get back to normal. Is the pull for a lot of people. So you hear, I'm going to mandate 2 days a week. Why? Does Monday matter more than Wednesday? Is Tuesday the right day? There's a bigger question as to the purpose that you bring people back is what I look for. So I'm a proponent of the hybrid environment if you've got purpose of why you're bringing people back. So if you're bringing, if you're going to use that location as a reason to bring people in to gear them up about a new client or a new initiative or a new program and generate some camaraderie, I think that there is a social implication that we need to look at of bringing people together and getting them communicating. But I think the biggest discomfort that still remains for organizations is how to work with collaboration tools. We've learned some, we've all gotten Zoom, but we've got Zoom fatigue. What tools are we using, particularly as your workforce is global or is remote, or you've had to throw out some of those rules that say we can't allow our temporary or our agency workers to have access to the same things as our full-time workers, but now everyone's remote and the lines between have gotten blurred, that people are still kind of figuring out that I need to change things. And I don't think that they've adapted to learn some of the tools that are out there that can make them even more productive with remote teams than maybe what they are experiencing today. Anita?
Yes, I think that that your point of view, John, but I also think there's something in addition, and that is that the way we work hasn't fundamentally changed in over 100 years, but the things we do and the technologies that we use have changed fundamentally. It's completely different. And the ability to work remotely was available long before the pandemic. And it was a good thing that it was, because when we needed it, we could apply it, right? But it was never meant to be 100% for everything. That was not the way that I worked remotely prior to the pandemic. I went into the office some days, I worked at client side. And so what really was missing in this, let's say within a month, everyone worked remotely, was a thoughtful approach about what should you do remotely and for what things should you meet with colleagues where. And so I fully agree with John. Having people come to the office on Monday or Wednesday is arbitrary at best. It has no influence on the result of work. But what I always recommend that people do is think carefully through the different activities that you need to deliver, and then decide for each one of them where they should take place. For instance, allow your people to read reports or email or write reports at home. But then when you have a meeting, or when you, for instance, interview a candidate, or you have a one-on-one, do that in a place of work, not necessarily an office, because if you have only one office in a country and everyone needs to commute to that office and it's 2 or 3 hours, why not have people meet up, somewhere around where they both live in a co-working location? So companies should really think through the opportunity that the pandemic gave them when redesigning work, because if you do insist that people come back to the office on a Monday, everyone sits in traffic at the same time. People are simply not going to put up with that, because it makes absolutely no sense. And Connor, you mentioned the labor shortage earlier. If people don't like what they're doing, or they don't like the policies that you impose on them, they're gone.
Yes.
You better listen to them and really think through what you need, because the policies that you design today will take you through the 2020s. So you need to design for a modern workplace.
Yeah, I think you both raised fascinating points in relation to the arbitrariness of being forced to go back on a Monday, a Wednesday, or a Friday. I was speaking with Pete A. Tiliakos recently from the ISG research group, previously of Nelson Hall, and he was speaking to me around the personalization of work. Essentially, his hypothesis is that we are in the era of personalization of work, and that the worker, she or he chooses where, when, and how they're going to work. And it really got me thinking, and I thought that makes so much sense. Would you agree, guys, with that hypothesis from Pete?
Yeah, it's this. We how we behave as consumers is influencing our lives more so than how we behave as workers. And we're finding that we like the consumer experience more and more. So if I have a bad consumer experience, I leave that organization and I go to the next. I find another restaurant, I find another shipping company, I find another consumer product company, I find another place to vacation, whatever it is. When we have a bad experience, the access to choice has increased so much, and the convenience of choice has increased so much because of this digital platform work that we're in, that we just move on. Yet in a working environment, people still expect you to fit into this standardized model that is for the efficiency and for the risk mitigation of the organization, not to make you feel special. And that's why you're seeing the people exit. That's why you're seeing the frustration occurring. So, look at your own organization and look at the marketing you do. Do you know more about the people who buy your product than you do about your workforce? Because most organizations are in that spot. And if that's where you are, you got to repoint your resources internally and start understanding who it is that is working for you and whether or not you're going to keep them engaged.
Yeah, fully agree. And that also goes for services that you provide to these employees. I know Pete well, and we speak on a regular basis. But when you, for instance, look at payroll and benefits, and in alignment with the trends that John just mentioned, over the past year, we've seen an enormous increase in requests for earned wage access, where before we would pay people once a month, maybe once every 2 weeks. Now employees want to have access to the money that they have earned the moment they have earned it, right? And it started with the platform companies like Uber and Lyft, who made that available first. But now it's almost becoming a demand from employees, especially in, let's say, lower wage situations. If you don't offer it, they will simply move on. And it is definitely, it definitely originates in the on-demand climate that we have generated through the use of mobile devices and always on services. So work is personal now, but it goes much deeper than just policies and procedures. It goes into everything. And the difficulty for employers here is that you often see these lists, like work used to be this, and going forward, work is that. Well, the problem for employers is that they have to deliver both, because, for instance, you can say, well, the past of work was very structured and the future of work is very networked. But there are still a lot of employees who like to work in a structured environment, as there are employees who like to work in a networked environment. And considering that there's a shortage of talent, if you want to attract the right people, you will have to work according to the model that they like best. If you don't offer it, they will not work for you. It's going to be a really interesting, but also very tricky situation for employers over the next years.
Yeah, I agree, Anita. Richie Smith, who's attending, and we know Richie well from his work in the contingent workforce and payroll space. But Richie's just sent me a really good point, and I think I agree with him. I think oftentimes we're really only talking about certain segments of the working world here, right? You know, we're talking about typically the professional classes, if you like, or the high choice, high paid workers that can really dictate when, where, or how they wish to work, and they've got higher negotiation skills, higher bargaining power. But Richie's making the point here: what about the folks that are working in manufacturing? How do we personalize the work experience for them? Essentially, you know, those folks typically can't work remotely, to the best of my knowledge. Of course, there's some dangers there in that sector with regards to jobs displacement and automation, but I don't think any automation or robotic tool has completely cracked that particular market. But I suppose, are we looking at this from a very narrow lens, or should we open up the discussion a bit wider?
So this morning, coincidentally, I published a post saying that, you know, there's only 20% of the global workforce is desk-based. 80% is desk-less. So what we sometimes call the blue-collar workforce is 4 times as big as the people that we most often talk about. And also from HR tech systems that I pay a lot of attention to, 95% of them are focused on supporting the desk-based workforce, and only 5% focus on the desk-less workforce. Now, that is rapidly changing, and that is also why I wrote the post, because once again, the mobile makes it possible to reach out to everyone in the workforce, regardless of their position or of their location. And that means that a number of startups, young companies, are now jumping on delivering services and solutions to this deskless workforce. And I think that, yes, they have been somewhat neglected over the past couple of years, and their experience throughout the pandemic wasn't great, and we didn't do enough to protect them and keep them safe. But going forward, given their size, and also given the fact that now founders as well as investors are starting to understand how huge this market really is, I think they will be much better served going forward.
And I just add in, if you go back to the personalization comment and think about the change that people are experiencing, that deskless worker, one, has an issue because they're a single parent and their child school was just shut down because of a COVID outbreak, and they need flexibility to be a parent at home and do homeschooling and take care of some things there because they don't have immediate access to daycare, or their daycare center is closed down. So they need one thing. The next one is looking for upskilling because they want the opportunity to move from one level to the next to increase wage level, to give them greater flexibility. So is the benefit package that you're offering, and I don't mean benefits strictly in a traditional sense, but how you're engaging the worker, is there some optionality into it to allow me to select those things that are important to me, as opposed to saying you get X and Y and Z, and those are the 3 benefits that we have as an organization, and that's what we provide, and assume that everyone wants the same thing. I think we have to recognize that there are nuances going on that are changing people's lives and what is important to them now. And if you're not spending time with those workers and finding out what it is that is motivating them, you're missing the biggest opportunity.
Yeah, I think, guys, you've raised both some smashing points. I suppose there's something gnawing away at me here around two-tier societies, and I'm thinking about it in the context of there's a number of legislative proposals in Netherlands, where Anita's based, in Ireland, around the so-called right to remote work. So let's say those legislations are brought before the respective parliaments or legislatures and enacted. There's really going to be two tiers in society, right? It's going to exacerbate some of the disparities in society, because you're going to have an automatic category of worker that won't be able to remote work. You think of the bus driver, the bus boy or the bus girl, the manufacturing person or persons, the deskless worker that needs to be on site. I suppose I'm concerned about this. How do we square this circle with regards to remote work essentially being seen in many quarters as a panacea to all the working world's ills?
Yeah, personally, I'm not a fan of putting this in legislation. I think this is between employers, maybe unions, and employees, and that is where it belongs, because as you mentioned, once you start creating national laws around the right of remote workers or the right to remote work, the consequence of that potentially is that you create or that you bring about inequality for a lot of other folks. And that you bring yourself, as a national legislature, you bring yourself into a really difficult situation. I would see much more benefit in defining what types of support you need to put in place when someone works remotely, right? Because we have all these laws that govern what you can do in an office and what kind of chairs and what kind of desks, and how to create a safe environment. So I think that would be my preference, if people would focus on how to provide safe environments, not only to remote workers, but to all kinds of workers, and not so much on the right to remote work. Because ultimately, if your boss isn't allowing you to work remotely as a professional worker, as a knowledge worker, you typically have options to go somewhere else where they will allow you to do that. And for a deskless worker, like John just mentioned, that the options usually are far more limited, because typically they're confined to a geography and are unable, as a knowledge worker is, to go online and work for anyone in the world, anywhere. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I just caution for any of those groupings, access to opportunity is quickly being democratized. And so that idea that if you're in a rural community and there's only one manufacturing plant, then that's the only place that you can work. And 3 generations of family have all been there. The opportunity to hop online and do some work, or to gain some skill and to make yourself available into the marketplace, is changing the opportunity that's available to people. And you began it, that if you're working as a barback and it's not working out because you're not being treated right, there's 100 other locations nearby who can use you and put you into a better opportunity. They're all being forced to rethink how they engage with a worker and what they do to meet those expectations. I think the challenge I put to the business is, are you still running on the same policy? For that manufacturing organization that's saying we can't get workers, are you still looking for people to work an 8-hour day with a 10-minute break in the morning and a 10-minute break in the afternoon and 30 minutes for lunch? Or have you altered that? Have you made alternative shifts available? Have you made part-time work available? Have you made a 4-day work week available? Have you altered things to start meeting the changing demand of the marketplace? That's become more important versus our traditional mode of the worker will adjust to what I want done. I have the power because I write the check. The worker has begun saying, I don't care. There are enough other people who are writing checks. You know, in the UK, your birth rate is a simple problem for thinking that you can continue to control workers. The size of the working population is going down, period. So that's an immigration policy thing. I'd rather, to Anita's point, I'd rather have the government looking at the size of the workforce and making sure we have enough people who are coming in, create incentives so that there's a skills match, but let the free market start determining who works where and see which policies, because we're full of policies that had unintended negative consequences. You know, I don't berate any of our lawmakers for wanting bad results, but we have too many experiences where the outcomes of policy have not worked well. They've instead created complexity that has prevented people from gaining easy access to opportunity.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can see anecdotally is that a lot of the barriers to entry or barriers to working elsewhere are being removed through the platformization or proliferation of some of the platforms that I hope to come on to in a few minutes, guys. But I think there's some really good manifestos for change. If any policymakers are listening to the conversation today. So Connor, if we could just move on to the next slide, I'd be very grateful, please. Okay, so John, Anita, most of our audience have probably talked about this a lot. I know that I certainly have on our podcast, and I'm just looking at our audience today, and I know I've had a number of conversations on these topics, but 63% of our respondents said that their organizations are struggling to attract talent. That didn't really surprise me how high that figure was. In fact, I thought it would be somewhat higher, given a lot of the problems that organizations are facing, and because we're in the midst of what has been described by a number of publications as a labour market paradox, where you've got millions of jobs and millions still unemployed or coming off government support schemes, and you've got that real disconnect there. The attrition piece, that sort of chat. After reading Anita's paper, which I hope she's going to speak about on the Great Resignation, that didn't really surprise me, Anita, and we'll come on to that in a second. But if we can look at organizations' struggle or inability to attract talent, why do you think that is, John? What are the structural or short-term problems here that we're seeing?
I think it's mindset is what I'd turn to first. If we're continuing to use old methods and old approaches, then we've broken something down. So in a simple way, if you think of job descriptions and the screening process, the process today is largely designed to narrow the pool. It's on an assumption that I have a wide base, and I'll set a series of criteria that will thin that down so that I have a smaller number of people to select from. Well, if we're in an inverted market where the supply side has the power in the equation because there's not enough supply, well, then your process needs to become inverted and you need to screen in. You need to remove some of those barriers that have maybe been there historically. And that could be, you look at criminal convictions. I get that I don't want an embezzler to be my accountant. I'm on board with that. I don't want someone who has drunk driving convictions to be my delivery person. But we spent the early part of this conversation on remote work. So if you're going to work 100% remote, why does DUI have anything to do with your ability to do the job? And so I think we've got these institutional processes that have been put in place that say, this is how people will work and therefore they're going to do. So that would be one element that I think is really there. And I just go back to the second of do you understand the workforce? I think people are not spending enough time talking on the front line, doing both the qualitative and the quantitative research to understand the behaviors of the worker and what their priorities are. And if you're continuing to expect them to fit your expectations, as opposed to you adjusting to fit their expectations, you're not recognizing the macro shift that's happened in the market. And I'll give one anecdotal example, and I'll turn it over to Anita. If you follow the New York Times, 6 months ago, all of the articles were about the Great Resignation and what you're doing, and you were seeing some fun things there. If you look at their business section now, you'll see an article from last week that was written on how to resign. So what you need to actually recognize there is their audience has changed. They're no longer writing to the company. They're writing to the worker. And it's a subtle difference, but it's a monumentous shift in the mindset of who is making decisions right now that is controlling outcome. And so again, for organizations, are you taking the time to recognize this macro trend that we're in the midst of right now?
Yeah, and John, you raised some interesting points there, and particularly the one earlier around demographics and the UK labour force essentially diminishing in size, right? And Anita, I had a question really on the structural problems, the wider structural problems that might exist with regards to talent pipelines and ensuring that organisations have the right talent for the new economy. And my question really is, do we need to do more at the education level, whether it's colleges, schools, universities, apprenticeships, skilling, reskilling, to address this problem? Have we essentially got an old school, forgive that term, an old school educational system for the new economy, and therefore there's a disconnect between the two? Or is it something more specific than that?
I think we have a talent shortage problem at all levels. It doesn't matter if you look at young people, if you look at people who have been in the workplace for 5 to 10 years, or if you look at people towards the end of their careers. The changes in technology and how that affects almost everyone in the workplace now are massive, and we haven't done enough to upskill and reskill people. Now, what you see with people early in their careers is often that companies hire because people have completed a certain education, right? They've shown perseverance and grit. They've been able to deliver a thesis if they come out of university. So companies look more at the education level than at the exact topic, unless you want to become a scientist, of course. But in very often in business positions, people will hire someone with a certain education, and they are fully committed to have that person work in a traineeship or some sort of apprenticeship for the next 2 to 3 years as they acquire skills and learn the business, simply because the business is so specific. So for that particular period of time, we're good. For the rest of it, we are probably in our elementary schools. Yes, we have to learn kids to write and to do arithmetic, but a lot of the other stuff that we're teaching them will not help them throughout their careers. And so I think we really need to revisit the curriculum that we have put in place. Also, we know, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the demographics, if you don't mind, because
Please.
We're talking about the labor shortages, right? But actually, they only persist in a couple of geographies. And we have known that for a long time because of the demographics. If you look at Europe, if you look at North America, we look at the demographic pyramids. Unfortunately, they are not pyramids anymore, and that is because to keep a population approximately in the same size, you need to have 2.1 children per female. Well, we have been below that in these countries for decades now. And so the people, especially the baby boomers, was a large generation. They are retiring, and the younger generations are simply not enough. They don't have enough people, bodies, to fill these positions. Automation isn't the answer here. Now, if you look at the global population, the global demographics, we have more than enough people to do the work. The problem is they're often in the wrong place and they don't have the right skill sets. And so if you look at Africa, for instance, that is a perfect pyramid. They have far more young people than old people. They have more than enough people to do the work in Africa, plus the work on various other continents. But then a compounding factor was, once again, the pandemic, where almost all borders closed, immigration stopped. And even though immigration isn't the answer to everything, we have always sort of used it to fill the gaps, right? And now suddenly we can't. And because of the pandemic, we had to put people in health professions, in testing, in vaccination programs. So those are out of the workforce. And to be honest, most governments have good paying jobs. So they are in demand, right? A lot of students couldn't work in restaurants, but they could work in the vaccination centers. And they're not going back for the foreseeable time because these jobs pay so well. So it's like there's all kinds of factors pushing the available workforce down, and there's not a lot of upside in the other trends that would normally help us grow the size of the available labor. So it's a perfect storm, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that analysis, Anita, and we'll hopefully get to touch on the borderless or international hiring, because I think part of that problem can be solved for and is being solved for, and hopefully we'll get a chance to discuss that. But Anita, and John as well, I read a paper that Anita published back in December, folks, and it was one of those air punch moments for me, right, which never look good on these bloody webinars. But I read it and I thought, yes, right? And I thought, yes, because Anita had challenged what I consider the received or conventional wisdom in relation to the Great Resignation. And I read Anita's paper and I've shared it and spoke about it widely. And we'll link it in the webinar show notes when we publicize it. But Anita, two questions really. What made you want to challenge the received wisdom that the Great Resignation was everywhere? And two, in short, what are as a brief summary of your findings for our audience, please?
Sure. Yeah, so it was actually purely anecdotal. So there were all these articles in the newspaper, in magazines, and I read a lot of HR publications, obviously, and they all spoke about the Great Resignation. But then when I looked in my network, I saw, the usual transfers around September, after the holidays and vacation, everyone always wants a new job, but it wasn't massive. And I just didn't see it. And so I thought, well, I have done this before on other topics. I was just curious about the data. I was just wondering, is it true? That's always my central question. Could it be true, or is it true? And then I start to look for the data. And actually, when I started to really do the research, I found that potentially we could say that, yes, the United States is really in the midst of a Great Resignation. And I think there it's more a little bit of a shock that people are actually resigning themselves, because the numbers of people changing jobs are not really that much higher. But in the past, it was always because employers fired people. All right. So it's more about who is doing the resigning. But then when I looked at other geographies in the world, and I looked at Europe, I included Australia, Singapore, and you know, some other countries for which I could find the data, it simply wasn't the case. And so resignation rates were more or less around what they were before the pandemic, but in most cases a little bit lower. And so me conclude that, you know, the great resignation really, it doesn't exist, except maybe in the United States.
Where I might offer a challenge point, not to the reality of those data sets, because I recognize them and I don't challenge that, but a trend that I think we're also seeing that maybe gives us a preview is the amount of people who are working in the gig economy today. And we all hear a lot of things about it. Simple reality of what we're seeing from a fact base at this point is that still 60% of the people who have registered on a lot of the platforms or are part of the creator economy have made no money. Okay, so we have a lot of people who are trying something. They have declared, I'm uncomfortable. So where are they coming from? You know, one, you do have a demographic aspect that you have new population centers that are getting an access to opportunity that they haven't seen. They're trying a competition or a contest, or they're doing logo or website design. You know, they're figuring some things out there. But from the research I've done, my sense is a lot of it is the person who has quit the 60-hour work week. They've said, you get what you're paying a salary to me for. You get the 40 hours, you get the 8 hours a day, you get 5 days a week, but you're not investing in me from a learning and development perspective the way that I once heard about. I'm going out finding my own courses. I'm going to edX and taking classes at Harvard on my own and learning that. I'm going to YouTube and learning things on my own. Doing things that way. And the only way that I can get the opportunity to do those things or to try to use these new skills is if I do it on my own time. And so I think the trend that we've got to watch for is, does that 60% who are not making money start diminishing? Because if that becomes 50 and then 40 and then 30, then I think you will see the great resignation become a much bigger thing to the large enterprise, saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm finding that there are services available that are empowering me to become the independent worker. I'm getting access to resources that are freeing things up, and I get to do what I want to do. So I think we're seeing some trends that say, I'm unhappy with the way I'm being treated. And maybe I'm still a little nervous. The economy's been a little bit touchy. I like the comfort of a salary. Everyone will declare that. But when that doesn't become the necessity, and if we look at Maslow's hierarchy and what we expect, and my sense of belonging is missing because I don't go to a place where we create community, and I'm getting less and less comfortable, then those elements are going to break down, and I think you'll see people starting to move out. So I actually think we're in the very early stages of a great resignation, and it's because the worker is still trying to figure out whether or not they can, but they haven't fully committed yet.
Yeah, John, it's interesting the point you raise, and Connor, if you could move to the last slide on freelance management platforms, please, if that's okay. There was a really interesting paper for our audience published by the International Labour Organization on digital labour platforms. It was published, I believe, around March 2020, so probably a bit early for in the course of our conversations, but it looked at platforms such as freelancer.com, and I think at the time freelancer.com had around 50 million registered persons ready for work on their platform. But interestingly, John, to your point, at any given stage, only 100,000 persons were utilized on that platform, right? So that tells its own story. I haven't seen the follow-up data, so I suppose we're looking at older data, but that does chime with me, what you've said there. But looking at this, guys, over 50% of our respondents use digital labor platforms such as Upwork, Fiverr, freelancer.com. They're what I would describe as public talent marketplaces. Do Do you welcome or are you concerned in the growth or proliferation of such platforms?
No, I'm not at all concerned. I think it provides great opportunity to a lot of people around the world that they normally would not have. Now, having said that, I think, especially if I look at a platform like Fiverr, that originally was, $5 for a project, we need to seriously look at what we pay people to deliver the work. And if we are, as your graph shows, if we are concerned about the quality when we hire freelancers, well, first of all, we have to make sure that we really define what we want them to deliver. We pick the right person, but we also pay them appropriately. Because if you pay $5 for something for a logo that you want to have designed, you get a $5 logo, right? And not a $50 one. But I believe that, well, one of the things why these digital platforms are so popular is because it gives people options and it allows them almost to diversify their risks, right? I often talk about younger people who have gone through the financial crisis and saw that, from one day to the next, their parents lost their jobs and there was no support. And now with the pandemic, from one day to the next, they were the ones to lose their jobs. And fortunately, in many countries, there were support programs in place, but still it is a shock. And so it's no wonder at all that they are thinking about how can I diversify my income streams? And if I have a skill that I can market on my own and that commands a price or potentially a premium price, then by all means, go and do that and work for a boss another 3 or 4 days a week, and then maybe flip it in the future. So from that respect, I think the creator economy or the talent platforms offer great opportunity. And they also, I always recommend to employers that they really look at these talent platforms when creating their talent strategies, because that is where you will find qualified people that you will need in future to deliver on your business strategy.
And
Go ahead, John.
where I'd go with this, Connor, is you got 3 platforms that are named there in Upwork, Fiverr, or Freelancer. There are over 800. So you have a blossoming of a marketplace that has just mushroomed out. What is a little concerning is the lack of clarity, both for the individual and for the enterprise, of which platform should I go to for the worker that I'm looking for, or to embrace me and give me access to the work I'm looking for. So I think that's a part of a market evolution, and that's one of the things that we're addressing with the Center for the Transformation of Work, and what we're going to try to bring forward into that marketplace. So I think you have some interesting aspects of kind of seeing an emerging market evolve and start bringing consistency to services. But I also think this is a place where companies like CXC really play into this for the enterprises. And I don't mean to offer a commercial for you, but I think that this aspect of, I just want the right worker, and companies don't know how to make sure that they do it in a legally compliant way. And that is a genuine reality that they need to be addressing and make sure that is there. So I think you're starting to see, are some of these platforms strictly sourcing an individual? Oh, they told me who can do the work, but now I've got to figure out, how do I engage them in a compliant way? How do I make sure I'm following local labor law for that? Expectations of look for the flexibility and the ease of doing business from the enterprises, but it's still a struggle for a lot because for the last 10 to 15 years, the business has been trying to standardize everything that they do. They put in a global business services function or a shared services function to bring things to standard so I can get value for money and so I can mitigate risk. Yet we go back to the start of our conversation where every worker wants something personalized to who they are and what they want to do. And to Anita's earlier point, it's not binary. You can't do A or B. The world is living in gray. So if you want everything to be black or white and you don't accept the gray fringes that we're all living in today, your business is going to really struggle. So how do I experiment with these platforms? Yeah, I give one example of NASA, the US Space Agency, that I think is one of the true leaders in thinking about this. My numbers may be a little bit off, so I apologize if they're not exact, but generally you'll get a sense. 17,000 full-time employees. So 17,000 workers on their payroll, government employees, good paying jobs, that's their core. 50,000 contract workers. So they're using outside agencies to help them execute some different things. 110 million global citizens have contributed ideas and IP to the organization. So when they go to solve a problem, they don't just look to the internal workforce. They're looking to the global community who care about the projects and the things that they're doing to say, if you're interested in helping us solve this, we want your support. That's a different mindset than most organizations have today. And until you can start seeing that, you're going to be working in too narrow of a pool. And to your previous slide, you're going to continue to struggle to attract talent.
Well, guys, I know we're coming up to the hour, but this has been truly fascinating. I really appreciate your time, guys, your insights, your commentary, for taking the time to review our labour trends survey. And guys, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. That was brilliant. Have a great day ahead, and thanks very much to our audience as well, folks. Really appreciate it, and we'll share the report with you folks later today. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, John, and thank you to our audience, and of course Connor, who co-authored the report. Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.